Forest spirits. The trail had narrowed for 2 miles, pressed on both sides until spruce branches scraped his shoulders. Stephen Colden was unbothered. He knew this route so well his legs instinctively avoided roots, ducked under low branches, and adjusted for the shallow gully. That familiarity was the point. He reached the last ridge at 4:15 with fading light. In late October Montana, twilight was quick. The sky darkened from pale gray to denser hues as you watched. The distant trees blackened into outlines while the clearing below remained white. The cabin, backed against ancient spruce, sat at the edge, as always small, square, built by someone impatient with excess. It had one room, a south-facing window, and a stovepipe through the roof. Stephen spent 8 winters here. Each time he crossed the ridge, his chest eased like laying down a weight he carried so long he'd forgotten it. He paused, sensing something was off. Standing at the tree line, he stared at the cabin for a moment without action. The door was closed, and the stovepipe was cold, no smoke, which was normal since he hadn't been here since March. The snow surrounding the cabin was undisturbed except for a diagonal trail of animal tracks, likely deer, mostly covered from last night. Nothing stirred. The latch was undone, visible from 30 feet. Its small iron bar hung at an angle, instead of fitting properly across the door brackets. It wasn't broken, but forced, a subtle difference. Stephen had installed it himself 6 years earlier and knew how it should sit. Clearly, it was not aligned correctly. He paused for a minute, listening to the trees before walking down. The snow around the cabin was older, too, or 3 days of wind had softened it, but near the steps overhang, where wind didn't reach, he noticed a boot print. Rubber sole, wide toe box, not his. He wore lace-up leather boots with a lug sole, familiar to him as his handwriting. This was different. He shoulder opened the door and stood inside. The cabin smelled of cold and faint dampness like wet wood drying in a closed space. His gear was missing. The 2 canvas bags hung on the wall now lay on the floor. The metal shelf above the stove, where he kept a lighter, wire coil, and lantern globe, had been tidied items grouped to one side, not scattered. Someone had examined them carefully, but not thoroughly. Stephen placed his pack inside the door and stood clothed, unchanged. The odor disturbed him more than the mess. It was damp, heavy, and stifling, typical of old buildings with stagnant air. The scent triggered a memory of a hospital corridor in Billings, where flickering lights and waiting for news had left an impression. He moved quickly to the window, opened it to let in cold air, and took a moment to breathe outdoors, gazing aimlessly. He turned back and began work. The latch bracket was bent at the bolt. He needed to fix it with his small hammer and punch kept in his pack's bottom. The wall gap was worse than expected. Near the floor on the north side, where a log had slowly loosened over 3 winters, it finally left a 2-finger wide gap. Cold was significant, so he planned to pack it with oakum and nail a board before the temperature dropped soon, judging by the cold air. He lit the lantern. Its orange glow spread across the log walls and ceiling, creating a warm, dense light. The cabin stopped resembling a crime scene and became a simple functional space, marred by neglect. He carefully proceeded with repairs: stove, bracket, wall gap. He found oakum in the toolbox under the bunk and filled the gap until draft stopped. He nailed a board over it with 8 nails, ensuring each was clean. Replacing the latch bracket took 20 minutes since the bolt had loosened on the dried log. He drilled a new hole a 1/4 inch left. By the time he finished, the stove had been on an hour, warming the room. He ate beans from a can, heating them in the pot and standing over the stove because the table was still dirty and he had not wiped it. The beans were plain and hot, burning his lower lip on the first spoonful, which irritated him more than expected. He set down the pot and waited. Outside, the wind had risen, sweeping through the spruce trees with a steady low hum, like distant machinery. After eating, he cleaned the table and unpacked his gear in a set sequence: food in the crate under the left bunk, tools in the box, ammo on the high shelf, and the rifle on the hooks above the door. Familiar emotions, his hands knew them well. At the bottom of the main pack, wrapped in a flannel shirt, was the photograph. He packed it instinctively, like items from a long-standing drawer that end up in your hands without thought. It was a standard print, slightly faded at one corner. Anne and Lily on the porch of their whitefish house in summer, both squinting in the sun. Lily, 4, held a half-melted popsicle and laughed at something off camera. Stephen looked at it briefly, then placed it face down in the desk drawer and closed it. He sat on the bunk's edge in lantern light, listening to the wind without thinking. The stove crackled as metal expanded. The oakum sealed the wall, no draft. The latch was secure. The cabin was tight for tonight. Tomorrow he'd check the roof, woodpile, outhouse, and more. Almost asleep, he heard the howling from the north, across the creek in the dark trees above the clearing. Not close, about a mile or less, but visible. One voice rising and fading, then two more joining, until the entire pack howled together, rough and massive. He stayed still, counting instinctively 5, maybe 6 voices. That was a large pack for this area, since before he'd only seen smaller groups passing through. This seemed to be something from here. The howling ceased. Stephen lay in the dark with open eyes, listening to the wind return after the wolves' silence. Eventually, it just sounded like wind. He closed his eyes, sleeping poorly as usual on the first night. In the morning, while heating coffee, he stepped outside in bootliners to check the thermometer on the door frame. 21 degrees. The pale clear sky contrasted with the snow in the clearing, which was pristine, except for a set of large paw prints coming from the tree line, crossing the open area and halting at the cabin steps. The deep impression suggested a heavy animal. The long stride and slightly spread toes resembled a wolf moving cautiously, not running. The tracks ended at the step and continued no further. The creature had paused here before returning the way it came. Stephen examined the print size, then looked up at the window at the angle a standing figure would have seen it, feeling a quiet, unknown sensation. Inside, he poured coffee and sat facing the door. He woke before the lantern died, instinctively, as winter in the back country wired him for first light. Lying still under the heavy blanket, he listened to the stove ticking, the wind at the window, and the silence miles from any human sound. He swung his feet on the cold floor, wrapped himself in socks, long underwear, and flannel, then donned his thick canvas pants, leather boots, and retied them twice to keep numb fingers from fumbling. Outside, dawn's faint light revealed the snow's crust, still firm enough for travel, if timed right. His trap line awaited his routine. He checked his rifle, loaded it, and took his pack before stepping into the honest, biting cold, a reminder that survival demanded respect in this place. He crossed the clearing, boots crunching on the old snow that had frozen in thought enough times to form a brittle surface, passing the tilted outhouse and the neat-head high wood pile. That satisfied an unspoken part of him. He then descended the small slope toward the creek, where the landscape shifted from the enclosed world of cabin life to the expansive, indifferent stretch of spruce, fir, and charred trunks marking the burn 12 years earlier. A fire had crawled over the ridge and scorched this valley, leaving black poles and open ground, now favored by elk and followed by wolves, making it valuable in a way only a land-dependent man could understand. At the first trap north of the creek crossing, placed on a game trail between two rocks funneling paw and hoof, his eye caught disturbed snow and brushed spruce needles, indicating a moving entity stronger than a rabbit. His shoulders tensed. A man who sets traps recognizes that look from 20 yards. The trap lay on its side, chain stretched, the drag buried, jaws empty, bait stick gone, and faint impressions in the powder, made by a careful hand or stick, teased the meat free without triggering the pan. Kneeling, he studied the prints like a printed page, long oval tracks with molded sole edges, diagonal rubber tread lines, and a wider heel insulated boot marks, probably broader than his own. The exit track ran downstream parallel to his path, and he clenched his jaw, knowing his winter had unexpectedly gained a third party. He reset the trap, burying the chain, setting the pan, and replacing the snow until the surface seemed untouched, then attached new bait from dried meat in his pocket. Standing, he examined the broad impressions leading down the creek, pondering. What are the costs, the gains, the implications for his days ahead? The second and third traps told similar stories, each with minor variations. At a bend by leaning alders, a mink trap had been lifted and bent, bait gone again, while a heavier trap for a bobcat nearby was sprung, chain twisted, snow muddled with both animal and human footprints overlapping, obscure, requiring a long search for details that might matter later. A cat circled the set and backed off. The man moved closer, knelt, completed his work, then retreated and stood still, stamping the ground repeatedly, maybe deep in thought, simply breathing, like Stephen sometimes did alone. After a while, his legs began to ache from the cold seeping through his pants at the knees, and he realized he had to move to stay warm. Climbing the low bank, he took the stranger's trail, not to follow it completely, but to see where it led. The trail wound through young fir trees, their trunks still slender from the fire's regrowth, then opened into the burn's main stretch, where blackened snags rose from the snow-like ribs of a massive carcass. The sky above seemed wider, the light harsher, wind more noticeable now that there was less cover. He smelled the burn's faint smoky scent, even in winter's crisp air mixed with cold metal and pine, resin bringing to mind the first year after the fire when he and Anne had walked here, her predicting it would turn green again. He recalled nodding, distracted by a hawk overhead and elk tracks in the snow. The boot prints crossing the open ground headed in a straight line toward a distant ridge notch, leading toward a drainage and, with persistence, a gravel road connecting to another county. Whoever made the tracks was cutting through, not wandering, heading closer to the wolf run trails used by elk and deer on the burned slopes. He stood among black stumps and white snow, sensing an uneasy feeling in his stomach, neither hunger nor anger, but a slow, reluctant tightening whenever others disturbed the life he had sealed away since Billings. Out here, where no one could hear, he admitted to himself that seeing another man working his ground, setting traps, watching animals, felt like someone was handling his belongings, not because he owned the land. He knew better, but because solitude had become a kind of property he had invested in, more than the Whitefish house had ever been. On his way back, he chose a different route, climbing higher to scan the snowy terrain and tree lines he'd known for years, now searching less for the man, and more for signs of wolves being closer than last night's howls suggested. As the weak sunlight pierced the thin clouds, the clearing ahead in the burn brightened, the snow almost hard enough to cut, forcing him to squint at the glare, landscape flattening into white, gray, and charcoal, losing depth. Then he saw her. At first, just a gray smudge against dark trees, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized it was a large animal standing motionless at the edge of the open ground, perfectly still. The wind quartered from her to him, carrying her scent before her shape became clear. Her long legs, deep chest, and narrow head indicated she was no coyote or stray dog, but a full-grown wolf, calm and aware of her place in her world. Her mottled gray and off-white coat would fetch a high price if he considered such things, though he never did with wolves, given the strict regulations and low payoff. She carried herself with a patient, almost human-like stillness, her head turned just enough for him to sense, on a deep animal level, that her eyes watched him even if he couldn't see them clearly. They were close enough that his call would carry, but far enough to seem coincidental, like hunter and hunted intersecting by chance. He stayed still, the rifle hanging by his shoulder, a familiar weight he'd used on game, yet lifting it now felt distant, like the slow days in hospital when time dragged and every move seemed like betrayal. He and the wolf stared across the burned scar, the wind carrying a faint charred smell and a high whistle through dead branches. The space stretched in some undefined way, recognition, challenge, or a silent understanding that they were here by choice and necessity. After some time, whether 5 seconds or 50, she turned smoothly, not alarmed, and walked away along the trees, her paws matching the last wolf's trail, her tail level, head low, until she vanished behind the trunks, becoming part of the forest again. He was left alone in the cold, bright space of black stumps and cracked snow, feeling a subtle shift within him, too vague for words, but enough that his world seemed slightly different since leaving the cabin that morning. On his way back toward the creek, the air grew colder as the sun hid behind a thin cloud on the ridge, and his stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten since the night's beans. But the most persistent thought was not about food, wood, or the stranger's boot prints. It was the unsettling realization that the backcountry was not a deserted stage, but a place where other wills, human and otherwise, moved independently. For a man seeking escape from the pressure of society, that was both comforting and irritating, still hard to reconcile. By the time the sun crested the ridge and started its descent, the cabin settled into a steady rhythm. The stove radiated warmth, the damp smell faded, replaced by dry wood, coffee grounds, and the faint tang of gun oil from the rifle on its hooks. He began to feel again that this place existed in its own time, slightly detached from the rest of the world, not entirely separate, but close enough that phone calls, bills, and obligations felt like something that belonged to another man. He finished repairing the last of the chink between logs, stacked the kindling by the stove, ate late lunch of jerky and stale crackers, and reached for the coffee when he heard footsteps outside, heavy and steady. He froze, hand on the pot handle, not out of fear, but because long experience taught him that silence offers a moment to listen, and that moment can reveal whether to approach or withdraw. The footsteps approached without haste, unhurried, suggesting either ignorance of his presence or deliberate arrival, as if he belonged. A brief pause occurred outside, then 3 deliberate knocks on the door, loud enough to be heard over the wind and stove, but not rude. Stephen replaced the pot, wiped his hand, and stepped toward the door, feeling his jaw tighten from the strange discoveries, bent latch, boot print, and the uneasy feeling that hadn't left even after repairs. He opened the door, letting cold snow-scented air and spruce flow past. Outside stood a figure in a dark parka, the hood back revealing a weathered face carved by wind and sun, darkened skin, gray stubble, and washed-out blue eyes, hinting at too many winters of squinting into glare. The stranger's pack was heavy, straps digging into his shoulders through the thick fabric, with a rifle slung across his chest, its barrel pointed respectfully downward, not for show, but automatic from years around armed men who understood silent weapon language. "Afternoon," he said, his voice rough and cold-sanded. "Wasn't sure anyone stayed here in winter." Stephen observed him briefly, noting, rubber-soled, leather boots with scuffs, worn gloves at the fingers, indicating long use, the darkened leather of the rifle sling from sweat and oil. This wasn't a tourist off a trail. He lived here and knew the stakes. "Someone does," Stephen replied slowly, evenly. "Lost." Earl's mouth twitched into a cold smile. "More like turned around than lost," he said. "I hit the wrong drawer in the dark yesterday and kept telling myself it'd make sense by daylight. But daylight had other plans." Name's Earl. Backcountry etiquette combines suspicion and kindness, unwritten rules known to all who have survived out here. You didn't turn away a man claiming he was off his line during the snow and cold, nor did you want that man's ghost haunting you when spring's melt carried his bones out of a canyon. Yet, you also knew a stranger with a gun and unknown reasons could take everything in a moment if he chose. Stephen stepped back, signaling with his hand, "Come in, warm up." Earl moved with careful, economical steps, unloading his pack smoothly so it didn't block the doorway. As he rubbed his hands briskly and blew into them, Stephen watched his eyes quickly survey the cabin bunk, stove, table, shelves, rifle hooks, and a drawer possibly holding maps. It was the same sharp, efficient scan Stephen performed when entering unfamiliar space, and seeing it made his skin tingle. The stove's warmth touched Earl's face, adding some color, and he made a brief, genuine-sounding noise deep in his throat, or perhaps just habitual when entering a shelter. Stephen poured coffee into his only chipped mug, unused by anyone else in years, and handed it to Earl without ceremony, watching his fingers close around it, knuckles knobby, nails trimmed. Earl sipped carefully, closed his eyes briefly, then looked again and nodded, more to himself than Stephen. I owe you, he said. Are you running a line out here or just avoiding the world? Stephen shrugged, subtly hidden by his flannel. Both somewhat, he replied. 5 ab C5 equals LH5 equals at 85 at equals 0 10%. AE at 0 equals OOAB at CBC at C 8 Ka. Mink trap set in the burn, making weeks matter. Cabin's mine. In that sentence, mine meant time and effort, not legal papers. Earl understood, glancing at the stove, stacked wood, and patched walls. He took another sip, then placed his mug on the old newspaper, a small sign of respecting others' space. Seen anyone else pass through this season? Earl asked casually, like chatting about weather or game, but his eyes sharpened slightly. I might have crossed someone's sign yesterday at dusk, but the wind was strong, making it hard to tell. Stephen immediately thought of the rubber-soled prints by his traps, the careful hands that baited without tripping, and the boot tracks running parallel as if following or measuring. A faint, tense feeling grew in his chest, like a wire stretched close to snapping, reminding him that this moment could lead to trouble if left unresolved or addressed. Didn't see anyone, he said slowly, a mostly truthful response if seeing means face to face. He knew his father would interpret it the same way and disapprove. Tracks, maybe. Hard to tell with the wind, like you said. Earl watched him over his mug, his blue eyes steady but not hostile, as if assessing not just the words but the hesitation, the choices of what to say and what to hold back. For a moment, Stephen heard Anne's voice recalling how she cut through dinner conversations he wished to avoid, later telling him that people reveal themselves through small truths. He would often see it but pretend not to, longing to believe the best longer than advisable. Earl shifted the subject, asking, "Have you been coming out here long?" and leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight as his shoulders relaxed, letting the heat seep into his coat. This cabin looks like it's been handled by the same person for a while. Stephen answered 8 winters. Before that, I worked with the Forest Service, fire crews. Trail work. This was a hunting shack when I started, and I took it over after the original builder didn't return that spring. Earl's nod conveyed a shared understanding. Men familiar with such places knew didn't come back could mean anything from a heart failure while hauling wood to slipping on ice and falling into a ravine. The specifics mattered less than the land's silent indifference. Stephen sometimes imagined traces of the original owner's work, knife marks or notches highlighting, how sharing a shelter reminded him that someday someone else might sit where he was, examining his scars in the wood. Are you running wolves? Earl asked softly, shifting gears with a calm, almost nonchalant tone that masked his keen interest. Heard the state increased the tags this year. Folks over the ridge say there's a big pack working the draws, killing deer and elk that used to reach them by January. Stephen felt his fingers tighten on his mug, thoughts of morning tracks, night howls, and the she-wolf in the burn flashed through his mind. He sensed Earl wanted to steer the talk toward pelts, numbers, and bounties turning gray bodies into dollars. Recognizing this, he knew he had to choose his words carefully, more than he usually did when winter left him mostly talking to himself. Not hunting wolves, he said casually after a pause. Never was fond of it. There's enough work with fur that doesn't think about you when you close a trap. A flicker of something crossed Earl's face, neither contempt nor amusement, more like acknowledgement of a neighbor's non-drinking choice, filed away with a shrug as an unthreatening piece of information. He scratched his jaw, the sound of nails on stubble loud in the small room, then leaned forward with elbows on the table. I don't share that hesitation, he said. Wolf's a wolf. Back home, livestock guards say taking one out saves 3 calves later. I see money, especially if pups are near snare reach. Snow made the forest feel both smaller and larger, muffling sounds, so that each step echoed, yet revealing the lives that had crossed his path long before he entered. By early December, with storms settling into a pattern and the cold remaining steady, Stephen relight on tracks and the pale sky through the spruce to read the days. He headed out that morning driven by a simple goal unrelated to wolves or Earl after spotting an elk 3 days earlier and pondering how much meat could be preserved outside his cabin. He thought that frozen flesh might be the only certainty left in this unpredictable winter. The elk's trail had been clear, deep heart-shaped print in soft snow, long strides, calm movement likely heading toward a south-facing slope where snow was thinner and grasses still within reach. Under a tin-colored sky, with still air and his breath trailing like exhaust, he climbed toward that slope, boots breaking crust and crunching softly in the silent snow. Finding the trail again, a diagonal line of hoof prints softened by 2 nights of snow but still visible, gave him purpose. Following a single line was easier than tracking multiple signs of wolves, men, or memories. His rifle rested comfortably on his shoulder. As he ascended, his thoughts drifted not to a shot, but to Earl's calm, factual talk about wolves and money, no malice, which made it feel heavier. The draw steepened, trees thinned, snow deepened and softened underfoot, making him slow down not from fatigue, but from experience, warning him that rushing in snow risks injury or missing crucial signs, especially in dangerous country. The elk track branched right, left, then right again, navigating obstacles with ease across the terrain. After another 100 yards, it changed course entirely, heading away from the expected slope toward a shadowed side basin Stephen rarely visited in winter, partly because cold air and snow gathered there, and partly because better hunting spots were nearby. He hesitated, one boot raised, weighing following it against his planned route, then decided to follow, thinking that an animal's sudden turn likely meant something worth exploring, a reason to trust instinct over expectations. The basin opened up as he climbed a small rise, the cold thickening, penetrating his clothing and wrapping around his jaw, so that clenching teeth felt like grinding ice. Tall, old spruce trees encircled the basin, their dark, heavy branches sagging under snow, creating a quiet green-tinged cave where filtered light appeared muted, like water passing through moss. The elk trail circled the trees, then disappeared onto wind-swept ground, showing exposed earth and leaves. Stephen paused inside the shadows, considering where the elk might rest and how to approach silently before the shot. Suddenly, he heard a sound that didn't belong, the high yipping bark, almost startled, followed by a deeper growl and distant thumps, suggesting bodies colliding in snow, paws scrabbling, small teeth snapping, more excited than angry. Without thinking, he dropped into a crouch in the snow at the base of a spruce, his hand instinctively steadying his rifle, recognizing the moment wasn't about shooting, but observing the unexpected disturbance. He carefully advanced until he saw through a narrow gap between 2 heavy branches, avoiding brushing them and causing a snow curtain to fall on his head. Beyond, the small clearing came into view. As his eyes sorted the grays, whites, and shadows into distinct shapes, the sight struck him so deeply that he momentarily forgot to breathe. In the center, where the snow was flattened from frequent passage, 3 small shaggy pups tumbled over each other in a chaotic, limb-flailing mass of fur. Their bodies were long and narrow, paws disproportionate, tails whipping wildly as they rolled, bit, leapt, and fell, following a shared, almost rhythmic pattern like children playing with secret rules. One pup, larger, with shoulders hinting at his future, strength clumsily lunged at a sibling with a mock growl, but misjudged the distance, sprawled into the snow, which puffed around him in a white halo. He scrambled upright, shook his head in surprise. The second pup, leaner with a reddish tint along his sides, darted nervously around the others, biting ears and tails with reckless curiosity, movements jittery, as if unsure whether to commit to an action. The smallest of the three hung back, entering the fray later each time, often knocked aside, paws slipping in their tracks, pouncing half a beat after his brothers, and landing less heavily. Yet he kept coming, climbing onto his sibling's sight even as he slid off, his quiet persistence threading through the chaos. Watching, Stephen sensed another presence at the clearing's edge, larger, steadier, and reluctantly shifted his gaze there. She stood balanced on all four paws, her head low but not submissive, ears alert, her dense mottled gray and off-white fur blending seamlessly with snow and bark. If not for her moving her head to track the pups, he might have taken her for a shadow. Her eyes, even from afar, reflected a metallic gleam, and as she watched her young, a tension in her neck and shoulders suggested alertness rather than danger and awareness born from loving something fragile in an indifferent world. She appeared larger than he had thought when he saw her in the burn, with a deeper chest and visible muscles along her flanks when she shifted, and the space around her felt like a shifting border between safety and the unknown. The sharp musky scent in the air combined predator and family odors, tightening Stephen's throat not out of fear, but a deeper memory-like reaction, unlike wolves he'd known in hospital corridors during his time at the small unit of 3. His legs grew numb from the snow seeping into his pants, but he remained half kneeling, supported by a tree, as something in him sensed walking away would be like abandoning a confession. Time stretched as he observed the small drama's pups tussling, one breaking away to pant, and then being knocked back into the chaos. He recognized distantly and almost clinically that he was too close within scent and sight of a mother wolf in the open, risking crossing a line if the wind shifted or he made a sound, yet the rationality felt muted beneath a heavier thought the moment he saw what was before him and struggled to find words for it. He recalled Anne holding Lily on the porch during summer, how his daughter loved to drop sticks into the yard, watching them fall as if gravity could be unlearned through focus, and how he had once taken for granted that they would always be there, his refuge after fire seasons, a fixed point in a world he could come and go from as he pleased. In the quiet of the basin, smelling wolf, snow, and cold earth, he sensed that these animals lived fully in the present, driven by survival and care, unlike himself, haunted by past mistakes or future doubts. They didn't see death as inevitable, only feeling it in their bodies, not in endless mental loops. Watching them, Stephen felt a fleeting envy. He didn't know how long he stayed in that cold perch, but eventually the pups tired, their play slowing as they collapsed near their mother, panting and dusted with snow. Gray moved between them, sniffing and gently inspecting, nudging one when it tried to climb onto her back, stepping carefully so her paws didn't disturb any small bodies. After her circuit, she turned slightly, and in that small shift, everything changed, a faint ripple in the air that his body sensed before his mind did. Her nose lifted, nostrils flaring, testing the currents, and Stephen's heartbeat quickened, his chest misfiring because he realized that some trace of his scent, faint as it was, had reached her. The pups, tired and oblivious, lay half asleep, but Gray's stance shifted gradually, tilting toward him, ears forward, eyes narrowing intensively on the shadow where he knelt. In that moment, he understood, no words needed, that the silent, suspended awareness had ended. Early December settled over the drainage like a heavy blanket, gradually deepening cold and silence, until Stephen stepped outside with his coffee and felt that the air bit his nostrils and the snow beneath his boots no longer yielded but shattered. They had crossed into serious winter, with the skies shifting from pale clouds to a hard blue lid that offered light but no warmth. Each breath formed a lingering plume, as if the air hesitated to release heat. He moved carefully, not from fear of the cold, which he had endured in worse conditions, but because now each step was a small wager with the weather and himself, a careful balance avoiding the ice's crack or twist. His boots squeaked on the packed path from cabin to creek, over the familiar worn trail. As he crossed the frozen Clearwater Creek on the log he placed years ago, he focused less on balance and more on memories of the basin, the den, the green-lit hollow where he watched pups tumble in Greyguard. Since then, thoughts of that tree pocket have occasionally tugged at him, as if some small anchor was calling him back. He did not alter his root desecration, felt worse than trespass, but carried its shape in his mind, like the memory of a face he shouldn't think of. That morning, he took the upper trail along the ridge's edge, descending in a long curve toward the burn and the open flats beyond, where he kept his heavier traps. Although his eyes constantly scanned for new signs, fallen trees, shifted by snow or movements out of sync with the wind, he sensed a faint tension in his chest, unrelated to footing or weather. Somewhere nearby, Earl was also moving, working his line, and though backcountry rules said he couldn't own water, there were footprints in the snow-broad rubber sole tracks that felt like fingerprints on Stephen's tools. He reached his first trap just after the ridge began to drop, in a narrow notch where a game trail squeezed between boulders, guiding animals into a predictable path. As he approached, he saw with a sinking feeling that the snow around the trap had been disturbed not by an animal, but by human hands and caution. The trap was open and empty, the chain taut, buried in the drift where something or someone had pulled it, and the bait bundle wired above the pan was gone, torn clean with no ragged edges, just a smooth, twisted end. Ignoring the cold that bit through his clothing, he studied the footprints around the set. The familiar neat tracks of marten and rabbit, the broader heart-shaped impressions of a lone deer from the night, and overlaid the broad heel prints of the rubber soles he'd seen earlier along the creek. The stranger whose identity Stephen suspected, even without seeing his face, had stepped downhill, stopped short of the trap, knelt, leaving deep impressions, then worked the wire with skilled fingers. Stephen's jaw clenched as he followed the footprints, watching them fade into a larger trail intersecting his own, and for a moment the white landscape blurred in his mind, overlaid with the image of the cramped cabin, the orange lantern glow, Earl in his chair with a mug, noting with a flat tone that he saw wolves as money, especially if pups were near enough to snare. The memory hit him harder here than it had in the moment. Now, the words linked not just to a mouth, but to tracks and skilled hands. An old familiar anger stirred, one he once aimed at careless bureaucrats and homeowners whose neglect ignited fires. He rewired the trap, knowing ignoring it would be like abandoning his name on this land, and he wasn't ready for that, not to Earl or anyone else. His gloved fingers worked instinctively, the movements routine from years of practice, until the trap was set and snow smoothed over. He then observed the stranger's tracks, noting how they curved downhill, away from his line, toward the lower trail toward the corridor leading to the denning basin and older spruce beyond. He convinced himself it was coincidence most hunters and trappers this time of year would head toward the same protected draw and open feeding spots, and that a man walking into thicker cover didn't necessarily know about wolf pups in a hollow Stephen had stumbled upon by chance. The thought unsettled him, sounding like the justifications he'd heard from doctors and administrators when Anne's tests were late or mistakes were made, the kind of stories that mask trouble without easing its danger. His second trap was farther along the slope, by where the trail dipped through a young lodgepole pine stand that sprouted after the fire, the trunks close and straight, with limbs close enough to catch snow, making movement slow and scratchy. He could tell from 15 yards away that something was wrong, as the snow in the narrow corridor leading to the set had been disturbed more than last night's light flurries could explain, forming irregular mounds, indicating something heavier than a fox had passed through. Approaching slowly, he saw with a growing unease that the main trap remained buried under its snowbed, untouched, with no signs of disturbance around it. However, 10 feet beyond, along the central trail where any animal following the scent would step naturally, a different trap was set, its metal freshly oiled, dull, with whiter, heavier jaws than his, meant for larger game. It had been expertly placed chain buried deep under snow that resembled natural drift, with the pan dusted so carefully that Stephen, experienced in setting steel in dirt and snow, had to squint to notice the faint thinness of the powder. What truly tightened his throat wasn't just the trap itself, or that it was on ground he long considered as turf, but the track running through its center, a clear line of large paw prints, toes spread slightly with each step, each impression exactly where a wolf walking steadily would land. The snow filling the edges of those prints suggested they were no more than a day or two old, meaning Earl sensed who else had been here, analyzing the same snow story and deciding to leave his mark with steel. The reasoning was simple, almost brutal in its logic. Here the wolves go, here I will wait for them. Stephen stood over the new trap, breath forming long clouds that drifted away, feeling the world condense into a sharp focus behind his breastbone. The conflict was clear. These were his hills, his trap line, his winter, and another man had set gear in the snow without asking, staking a claim with iron. Beneath that practical anger, however, another layer pressed harder. He foresaw what would happen if a wolf, perhaps Gray or her pups, followed this path one night. He pictured the paw pressing down on the trap, the sudden snap, the fight against the chain, blood dark on white snow, the snow chewed into red lumps, then a desperate whine from pain and panic. The image was vivid. It sprang from recent memory of the basin, where small gray bodies had once been, now replaced by cold metal and untouched snow. He closed his eyes briefly to clear the overlap. His identity, hunter, trapper, man living by the simple rule of work for meat or fur pushed back instinctively, reminding him he had no moral high ground. He'd set his own iron in dirt and snow, taking animals that only stepped into his pattern. The difference between weasels and wolves was sometimes just human preference layered over regulations. His pragmatic mind saw wolves as resources. Pelts could fund fuel and repairs, and the state wanted their numbers reduced, glad to take each one Earl extracted. Yet a quieter voice inside, rooted in that cold green lit hollow where he watched Gray nose each pup, whispered that knowing their small world, seeing into it deeply, made him more than a passing stranger. He recalled Anne's words, which had returned to him repeatedly since her death, like small stones dropping into water they reminded him that some actions are done simply because one is present when they're needed. For the first time since coming here to escape others' expectations, he saw that phrase not as blame, but as guidance. He stood there long enough for the cold to climb through his soles into his ankles, biting at his bones, watching his breath slow from quick bursts to steady exhalations. The choice before him remained unchanged. It lay in the snow as plainly as the steel trap and paw prints, unaffected by his rationalizations. If he left it untouched, nothing would happen immediately, no one would know, and winter would continue with this unseen threat, not set by him, but by a man who had entered his cabin under the guise of shared hardship and coffee. If he dismantled the trap, removed the dog, and carried it away, he would cross a boundary he had long avoided, trespassing a man's gear, a deed known to invite trouble here. He realized with distant surprise that his anger toward Earl was less about territory and more about the position the man had forced him into, that he had made Stephen stand cold in a clearing, holding both his own code and this unwelcome truth about wolves, choosing which to break. He considered that he might be overreacting, that perhaps this was the solitary man's paranoia, the sort society laughs at, stories of hermits in the hills. But that thought faded when he visualized the three small bodies again, the red-tinted pup darting at siblings, the smallest climbing over a shoulder only to slip off. He hunched over. His gloves creaked as he closed his hands on the trap's frame, the cold metal biting through fabric. For a moment, he expected some omen from the land branch crack or whisper, but the forest stood silent, composed of snow, trees, and faint wind. He set the safety on the springs, eased the jaws open with practiced ease, lifted the trap, shook off snow, and looped the chain around the frame, each turn final. Holding the trap, he glanced at the trail wolf prints crossing where it lay, his boot marks, Earl's faint soles, and felt a strange, heavy quiet, as if some long-held noise had dropped away, replaced by uneasy stillness, knowing he had triggered something unseen, a ripple that would spread. He strapped the trap to his pack, ensuring the chain wouldn't clang, then turned toward the cabin, moving slowly not from the weight, but from the awareness that a tense, unspoken change would surface next time he met Earl, something sharp beneath the snow, silent and dangerous. The coming winter wouldn't be just about wood, meat, or weather, but choices made beyond instinct. Mid-December, the cold hit fiercely, not gradually, but as an abrupt sky's decree that mildness was over. For 3 days, temperatures stayed below zero during the day. The dry air made each exhale feel fragile, like shards. Stephen noticed early in the woodpile's sharp decline, feeding the stove more often, than in his hands, skin splitting along knuckles, stinging each time he grasped an axe or rifle stock. He watched the sky as he observed the tree line with the wary familiarity of someone who knew winds and clouds could be as deadly as claws. That morning, before stepping outside, he sensed the storm's approach. The small cabin's window reflected a thick, diffuse glare, indicating snow was being driven rather than simply falling. The thermometer showed 10 below, with the red line deep in the glass, blurring the distant trees into faint smudges, their trunks and lower branches nearly erased by the sideways moving white curtain. Such weather advised staying indoors, but E had neglected to check the traps along the burn for 2 days, and in this cold, anything left unattended would freeze into waste. Neither the pelt buyers nor his conscience could accept. He gauged the risk, pressing his palm against the doorframe, feeling the cold soak through the wood, listening to the wind's pitch, and checking himself for signs of fatigue. He was tired but within limits. His unease stemmed as much from restlessness as fear, with the cabin's close walls pressing inward. He dressed as if preparing for a fight, layering wool, flannel, and canvas, pulling on his heavy parka with stiffened fur, lacing tight boots that made his toes tingle before settling into dull pressure. He packed spare mittens, high-calorie snacks, a small shovel, and a coil of cord for emergencies, while the rifle felt heavier, not in weight, but in the energy it would demand to traverse the snowdrifts, shaped by the wind into deceptive forms. As he stepped onto the porch, the storm hit him like a living entity, with wind pressing against his chest and legs, making closing the door an effort. Snow spun chaotically, stinging the exposed skin between his scarf and hood. Visibility dropped to just a few dozen yards. Beyond that, trees and terrain blurred into a shifting gray, shrinking the world and increasing danger because what he couldn't see he couldn't rely on his memory to recall. Paths he knew by heart vanished beneath a uniform snow cover, transforming familiar landforms into an unfamiliar landscape. For the first time in a while, crossing the clearing and spotting the notch in the snowbank where his usual route entered the trees, he felt he was entering a place indifferent to his familiarity. Beneath the spruce canopy, the wind's bite softened but persisted, swirling around trunks and branches, sending fine dry snow drifting onto him, settling like ash on his coat and pack. The world contracted further, limited to the visible ground and nearby trees, prompting him to count his steps in a quiet murmur, another way to gauge distance when landmarks disappeared. He kept his compass in his pocket and checked it frequently, aware how easily a slight deviation could lead him off his course into unfamiliar territory. As he advanced, the storm pressed harder into the trees, snow's penetrating gaps in the canopy to drift into the understory. The firm packed trail beneath his feet softened, the crust breaking more often as his boots sank into knee-deep powder, cold and numbness, spreading with each step. His breath came harder, puffing out in clouds that instantly dissolved in the wind, sweat pooling under his pack straps in a dangerous dampness he knew could quickly worsen if he had to stop. He reached the first trap more by feel than sight, his hand finding the rough bark of the leaning pine marker, his eyes noticing the faint rectangular disturbance in the snow, indicating the trap's position. The trap was sprung but empty, the pan depressed, bait untouched. He reset it with trembling hands, cursing the time lost kneeling in the snow to work metal and wire. The second and third sets revealed similar fruitless results, and with each, his worry deepened not because the traps were empty, but because the fading daylight and increasing snow slowed progress, draining his reserves. When he finally stepped out onto the open shoulder overlooking the burn, the storm fully unleashed, stripping away his practical thoughts and leaving only a primal sense of being insignificant before something vast and uncaring. The wind buffeted him sideways, driving snow horizontally, the air thick with it. The burned tree trunks flickered like ghosts, here then gone with each breath. The horizon vanished behind a gray wall that blurred land and sky, erasing his usual cues. Far ridges, creek shadows cleanly wiped, as if erased with chalk. He should have turned back then. A clear, reasonable thought arose Moran's voice than his warning that no fur was worth blindly facing such a storm. That pride and habit wouldn't prevent his fingers from freezing. Yet another part of him, stubborn and wary of fear, reminded him that turning now meant battling the wind with tracks nearly erased, and that the path home was no safer than ahead. If he could reach the big rocks marking the line's midpoint, he'd know his position amid the white chaos. He hunched against the gusts, angling to cut through rather than fight the wind, counting steps and observing subtle land clues, the texture shift in snow, shapes underfoot changing over fallen logs. Time blurred, everything narrowed to lift, place, brace, and fatigue spread insidiously beneath the roar in his heartbeat. His vision darkened slightly at the edges, thoughts slow as if packed in wool. Recognizing the signs of hypothermia, clumsy hands, impaired thinking, he felt a sharp fear pierce the fog, aware of his body shutting down in the cold. He stopped walking not by choice, but because his legs, almost automatically, decided another step would be too much. He stood hunched in blinding whiteness, snow covering his coat, ice lining his scarf edges where his breath had frozen, forcing himself to look around beyond his misery for any shelter. About 6 yards to his right, hiding as a darker, uneven lump against the blur, lay an old blowdown of fallen spruce with roots ripped from the ground, limbs partly buried, creating a shallow curved wall with branches and snow forming a natural hollow. He stumbled to it, breaking through snowdrifts that grabbed his legs. At the wind's lee, the roar diminished to a muffled rush, snow swirling more lazily in the small calm pocket. He dropped to his knees and cleared snow beneath the fallen trunk with bare hands as his gloves became impractical, feeling his fingers sting from cold while scraping down to frozen ground and needles. Widening the hollow enough, he wedged himself inside, using his pack as a backrest. This work warmed him slightly, boosting circulation, and when he finally squeezed into the cramped space, he realized, with mixed relief and dread, that this might be his only safeguard from a slow, quiet end, an ending he sometimes, in darker moments, had resigned to. The storm raged outside, but inside his shelter, its force was muffled, sounding like distant surf. He could hear his ragged breath again, uneven within the narrow space. Removing his pack, he covered his raw fingers with spare mittens, then fumbled with the thermos until he unscrewed it and sipped lukewarm coffee, the warmth spreading through him with a comfort almost too sudden. He knew he couldn't stay forever. The shelter would block the worst wind and buy him time, but it wouldn't refill the woodpile or raise the thermometer, and at some point, he'd have to stand up and face the storm. For now, the urgency eased enough to let him think, and in that cramped, dim hollow, with snow pressing around him and rough roots at his back, his mind drifted when the present felt too sharp. He envisioned with startling clarity the narrow hospital bed where Anne lay, her skin nearly matching the sheets, monitors humming, and the window showing a bleak sky like the one outside now. He remembered a deeper cold then, less about weather and more about knowing there was no shelter against what was coming. He thought of Lily, whose last winter never felt like winter thanks to hospital climate control, and how he told himself, after they were gone, that had retreated to these hills not to pursue death, but to remain outside everyone's life in a holding pattern where nothing new could be lost or gained. Now, in the storm with tingling toes and stinging skin, he saw the bitter irony. Despite his efforts to withdraw, he might vanish entirely, body lost in the snow, discovered in spring by elk or not found at all. The thought made him feel heavy, but also raised a question: was that really all there was? Was he willing to let his story fade away in this hollow without making even a final conscious step in some other direction? To his own surprise, he realized that the first image of who might notice his absence wasn't his brother hearing the news later or a Forest Service report, but a gray shape at the basin's edge, ears alert, eyes bright, turning at the faintest scent of something missing along a familiar trail. He was uncertain what to think, but the storm left no time for questions. The cold returned as the coffee's brief warmth faded, muscles stiffening in the cramped position. Standing was as risky as staying. The hollow was a pause, not a solution. His practical mind knew that if he sank further into stillness, the urge to lie down and remain would grow a predator in this weather. He shifted, clenched his numb fingers around the pack straps, and edged out of the hollow. Wind and snow struck him like a slap. The world outside hadn't softened, if anything. The storm worsened with bigger flakes and more savage gusts. Yet, within him a small, firm resolve had taken hold, replacing routine and habit. He rechecked his compass to keep the cabin's direction no longer a vague hope, but a goal. Turning away from the hollow, he felt he was leaving behind more than just the ice. He was walking away from death. The return was a struggle of persistence and small, determined steps, each foot lifted rather than sunk. Later, spotting the faint outline of the cabin through the thinning snow, its roof buried in drifts, relief burst from him somewhere between a laugh and a cry, lost in the wind. His legs, exhausted and alien to him, staggered to the door, which he pushed open with his shoulder, spilling into the warm, silent refuge of the single room. The cold struck him sharply, despite the stove being barely fueled, and as he slammed the door on the storm, leaning against it with chest heaving and snow melting onto the floor, it took a few seconds to notice the porch snow wasn't undisturbed. A flattened area in front of the door revealed a shallow rectangular dent, like someone standing there, shifting weight before deciding to knock or leave. The storm subsided suddenly during the night, leaving a clear sky and bright stars above the ridge. Stephen stepped out to fetch wood before dawn, feeling as if walking beneath glass in the brittle, dry cold that made his nose crackle and eyelashes form crystals. After the chaos of the blizzard, a strange peace settled, silence so profound he heard tiny creaks inside the cabin as logs adjusted to temperature. He slept deeply after returning from the hollow, sinking into a dreamless black when his head hit his makeshift pillow, and upon waking hours later, he felt bruised, uncertain if he'd be struck again. Still, routine pushed him. After coffee, he slipped into his boots and coat, the faint impression on the snow reminding him of last night's flattening. He lingered at the threshold, gazing down at the snow patch with the unusual flatness. In the gray morning light, he saw more clearly. The snow in front of the door had formed two shallow troughs, the right size and spacing for human boots, with grounds at their ends suggesting someone stood there, shifting or bracing against the wind. Most tread marks had blurred, but the shape was unmistakable. He stepped over it, feeling a twinge at the idea of someone standing there, perhaps listening at his door. He couldn't be sure it was Earl, but his mind painted the image: a weathered face, washed-out eyes, worn parka, hands slowly turning his mug, nearly no doubt. His chest tightened, not with anger, but with growing pressure, and he glanced at the trees as if expecting someone to step out, cap in hand. Nothing moved. He headed toward the burn, as work waited, and he needed to check his traps before the storm ruined the meat or fur. The snow was thicker and looser now, shaped into waves and ridges by the wind, making every step carefully placed his calves burning from pulling free from deep drifts. The forest was quiet after the storm, like silence after shouting, where every sound checked itself. His own footsteps sounded, loud boots thudding, fabric brushing snow and branches, leather creaking, and he sensed something large moving nearby. Not close, but not far, sensed through subtle changes in bird calls, wind shifts, and the faint trace of disturbed snow. He slowed, adjusting his grip on the rifle, and shifted course to a small rise with a view into the shallow draw ahead. From his position behind a spruce, he saw the tracks, fresh, sharp-edged, untouched by snow or drift. Large, heavy prints stretched out in a steady stride wolves, many of them forming a line of paws moving up the draw, fan-like at a fork and converging where the path narrowed. He observed the empty draw briefly, listening, but the pack had already gone elsewhere, their absence left a quiet almost as vivid as their passage. Crossing their trail on the main path, he paused, crouched, and placed his gloved hand near a print, measuring without touching. Gray's mark, if he remembered correctly, resembled this wide, confident, deep from her weight, and he wondered whether he could ever distinguish her track from others, or if that was just a human desire to name and understand the wild. The pack moved toward the ridge, then left, heading to an ancient spruce stand where uneven ground from a long-gone homestead hid timbers beneath snow now, just subtle signs of human influence in the forest. He stored that info with others, part of the bigger picture, and continued to the open edge of the burn, where his traps lay before the storm. The first two he checked were empty, jaws open, pans untouched with only small bird tracks in the snow, hopping in the weak sunlight after the blizzard. He saw the color at the third spot he favored, where the old fire's line formed a natural funnel between a group of trees and a rocky outcrop. From afar, the red patch seemed almost unreal, too vivid amid the white and black terrain, like a dropped cloth. As he moved closer, stepping through the crust into softer layers, the shape revealed itself as something painfully familiar and wrong. A wolf lay just beyond where Earl's large trap had been placed days earlier, twisted in an awkward half-collapsed position, having fought hard and then suddenly stopped. The young animal, not a pup but not yet full-grown, had long thin legs, faint ribs beneath its thick winter coat of mottled gray, cream, and tan. The trap clamped its foreleg, jaws sunk deep into flesh and fur, with dried blood forming a frozen, dark collar. The surrounding snow was torn and piled in jagged mounds from its thrashing, marks of pain and struggle. Blood droplets and streaks circled outwards, forming a pattern that seemed to accuse despite itself. Its lips pulled back as it died, exposing teeth in a snarl-like grimace, but Stephen knew it was muscle contraction and involuntary jaw clench signaling death's final act. Its eyes, half open, had a dull, lifeless film, catching no light, with the tongue between its teeth frozen in a blackened curl. He stood over it, cold seeping through his layered anger, sensing the wrongness of the scene not because he hadn't seen animals caught in traps before or caused it himself, but because he had watched this pack in life, seen their playful cruelty as pups and their grace as adults. Connecting this lifeless form to those memories felt like juxtaposing a daughter's photo with a clinical disease description, the same story, but jarring to absorb. The trap revealed what he suspected, how it was anchored, the steel's make and model, the nick on one jaw from a rock. It was the same style he saw on the wolf trail days earlier, favored by Earl, and thinking of that earlier attempt to prevent this brought a dull, useless feeling like a firefighter arriving after a house's foundation had burned out. He might have lingered, examining tracks around the kill, if not for another sign catching his eye, prints of 2 or 3 men, deeper and more varied than a single pair of boots, moving around the wolf and away across the open. Other clues included a half-buried cigarette, but with stained paper and a frozen end, a scar where someone had placed a heavy pack, and a rough patch of ice where a person had braced to drag something. He turned and saw the drag marks leading toward the trees, 2 parallel troughs carved into the snow where a sled or travois had dragged, and any doubt about Earl working alone vanished. This was not the careful, solitary work of a poacher. It was a small operation, a crew that planned, hauled, smoked, and laughed here in his winter quiet. The feeling of unease was different from simple anger at a trespasser. A lone man could be confronted or scared off, but a group with its own stories and reasons for being there posed a greater threat. They would tell their own grievances and justify their presence, and he would be cast whether he liked it, or not, as the guy in the cabin who looked away or ignored them. He watched the boot prints until they disappeared into the dark woods, not ready to follow, then looked back at the dead wolf, its stiff body, and the hole in the snow where its leg had been torn off during the struggle. The practical part of him, used to extracting animals from the hills, debated whether to save the hide or leave it, but touching the body felt like invading someone else's story, making his skin crawl. Since that someone was Earl, it complicated matters. Taking the pelt would be theft in the eyes of the trap setters, and he didn't want to worsen things between them. He backed away and noticed a small lighter track just beyond the churned circle, pressed once into the snow and then gone, as if a creature hovered there before retreating. It was another wolf print, similar in size to the deceased, but the toe angle suggested a cautious approach, perhaps nose to the cold flank of its packmate before turning away. The thought of that silent visit, of a living wolf standing where he was, looking down at the mess, pressed painfully in his chest. He remained standing under the pale storm, clear sky when he heard bootsteps behind him, clear despite the muffled sound of his own movement. He didn't start. He had anticipated this, as you do when you already know the ending of a story, turning slowly to face the man coming up the slope. Earl arrived, moving with his characteristic compact, efficient stride that Stephen had first noticed on his porch. He wore his parka zipped high, a low cap, and well-used gloves. A younger man with broader shoulders walked a few steps behind, his face partly hidden by a scarf, while another figure moved near the tree line, heads bent as if examining the snow. Earl glanced briefly at the carcass, then returned his gaze to Stephen, calm and calculating, as if he expected this scene. "Hell of a thing, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the dead wolf. "Storm like that, you think nothing's moving, but work doesn't stop when the sky's angry." Stephen met his eyes silently, knowing words now could define what lay ahead. The wind tugged at their coats, stirring small snowdrift around their boots, and for a moment only the four of them and the frozen animal existed, the rest of the valley a silent, watchful void. "It seems your storm was waiting for them," he said flatly, with no warmth in tone despite feeling it deep inside. "You positioned steel where they walk, weather didn't need to help." Earl's mouth flicked in a gesture that might have been approval, his eyes fixed on Stephen. "That's knowing your stuff," he replied. "You read the ground, see who uses it, and turn it to your advantage. Just like you've been doing with mink and cats all these years." The comparison of his own line with the bloody circle made Stephen's jaw tense, but he kept his tone steady. "Mink don't hunt in packs or target calves and yearlings," he said. "They don't howl outside homes to scare children. There is a clear difference." Earl shrugged, a small economical lift of his shoulder, implying he's heard such distinctions before and considers them personal preference. "Mostly, it's how people talk about them," he said. "If a man in town loses a few calves, he doesn't mourn mink. He phones his brother-in-law to see if anyone will take a tag or two. Wolves are just another line on that ledger. Take one, save some beef, get paid. Everyone rests easier." Stephen recalls the den, the pups tumbling in the sheltered hollow, Gray's eyes locking through the branches, and the word everybody chokes in his throat like gristle. He understands that cattlemen, ranchers, and locals have their own cost calculations and stories of animals lost overnight, their bank accounts shrinking, and that for them, a dead wolf in the snow isn't a tragedy but relief. Still, here, with this body at his feet, the numbers don't add up so simply. "Are you working alone?" he asked, though the answer was already obvious behind Earl in boot and breath, as some stubborn part of him wanted to hear the man specify his numbers. Or are you bringing a crew to make sure nothing furry escapes alive? The younger man behind Earl shifted, maybe uncomfortable or just impatient, but Earl's face remained unchanged. He briefly glanced back, surveying his companions, then returned his gaze to Stephen. "A few of us from over the ridge," he answered. "People talk, you know how it is. News spreads there's a good deal here. Tags are cheap if you know who to ask. It would be foolish to leave that money unclaimed, especially with current winter feed costs. You've been here long enough to understand that." Stephen understood, as clearly as the feel of an axe handle or the sound of ice in a creek, that this man viewed land and its residents as a balance sheet, with no room for sentimentality, whether den scenes, cold morning breaths. He also knew this talk was closing a chapter already decided when he lifted Earl's trap off that wolf trail. Each word now either set that line firm or blurred it. "I've been here long enough to see that when everything moves as a dollar sign, you stop noticing much else," he said, hearing his father's bluntness and not minding it. "Are you planning to run the entire pack out?" Earl glanced past him toward the slope where wolves' tracks led earlier, narrowing his eyes against the snow glare. His voice remained composed, but carried a subtle steel edge not present over coffee in the cabin. "I'm committed to my goal here," he said. "You can run your line as long as you don't interfere with mine. But if we start crossing each other's paths or taking each other's catches, things will get complicated, and neither of us is young enough to enjoy chaos." He paused, then added softly, "You understand me?" Stephen remembered the trap in his shed, a clear sign he had already crossed Earl's line in the most literal way. For a brief moment, primal fear flickered through him, less about right or wrong, more about the image of himself caught in some dark misunderstanding in the woods. But stronger now than a month ago, he recalled his gloved hands lifting that trap from the wolf trail, feeling a calmness settle as if a long misaligned part of himself was finally realigned. He met Earl's gaze steadily. The words he might have spoken about boundaries, leaving the wolves alone, about his winter and valley were pressed behind his teeth, but he held them back, not from fear, knowing no sentence could change Earl's nature or purpose. The choice was simpler and heavier, to lower his head and move his traps further up a side draw, pretending they shared the ground, or to stand on his moral ridge, aware it could cost him. He said nothing in response to Earl's last question. Silence stretched between them, filled with faint wind-over snow and the distant crack of a cold tree. And in that quiet, Stephen felt a resolve already made when he lay in the snow above the den, watching small gray bodies wrestle in a circle of light. The sound came just before dawn, when the world was neither night nor morning, and the cabin seemed to drift in its own cold, dark bubble, cut off from the forest's slow shifts in the dark. Stephen lay half awake on the bunk, one arm blocking the faint glow of embers, his body still heavy from yesterday's trek. When the howl pierced through the floorboards, so long and steady, unlike typical hunting calls, it snapped him fully awake before he processed its tone. It started low, a rough vibrating note seeming to emerge from the frozen ground, then rose in a thin broken line that trembled at the top and fell in small choked drops, like a voice cracking. He had heard wolves call across drainages or warn of intruders, but this cry carried raw panic and refusal, making his hair stand on end under the blanket. He lay still for a few heartbeats, waiting for a reply, but the silence was absolute. Deep in that quiet, his mind was made up. As he swung his legs off the bunk, the rest of him caught up. The cold cabin air made him breathe out smoke as he hastily pulled on his pants and wool shirt, fumbling with buttons that had never posed a problem before. He skipped coffee, didn't add wood to the stove, grabbed his coat, and laced his boots hastily, knotting them crookedly. In instinct, he reached for the rifle, slung it across his back, and stepped into the pre-dawn darkness. The sky over the ridge was a deep bruised blue, with a faint light along the eastern edge signaling dawn. The snow reflected this hue so fully that everything appeared in shades of steel. Though the cold was intense, he barely noticed it beyond the lung-aching sensation when inhaling deeply to listen. Standing on the porch, head cocked and eyes scanning the dark tree line, he searched for movement. The second howl sounded from the north, across Clearwater Creek and toward the old spruce stand where the ground was uneven from past construction. It was shorter, jagged, as if the throat was raw, and beneath it, Stephen thought he heard a faint high-pitched whimper, more distant and cold than a true howl. He didn't hesitate, already turning, boots slipping from the porch. He moved across the snow, balancing urgency with cautious winter step placement. The crust was dry and squeaked underfoot over loose powder beneath, sending small sprinkles of crystals around his legs, the cold seeping through gaps in his boots. Crossing the frozen creek between two rocks, his boots slid briefly on the slick surface before he reached the far bank and pressed into the thick trees, their branches low and heavy with old storms. He moved up the slope toward the sound, guided more by instinct and a faint pull in his chest than by knowledge of the terrain, though he sensed that his path would bring him near the basin, and the tangled roots he noticed beneath the snow weeks ago. As he climbed, a sharp, musky smell associated with the pack filled the air stronger now, layered with iron, blood, and the sour scent of fear. The third cry wasn't a full howl, but a broken, rising series of sounds, seeming to crack in the middle, coming from just ahead and below him. Pushing through a dense stand of young firs, their needles scraping his coat, he nearly stepped onto the edge of trouble before realizing what he saw. A sudden drop in the ground, a circular depression 3 or 4 yards wide and at least 10 feet deep, with steep or undercut walls where snow had slumped. The bottom was a churned mess of earth, ice, and dark-rotted timbers, which he recognized as remnants of the old root cellar he had noticed earlier. The snow crust above had looked solid for pawing, but now lay in jagged slabs at the bottom, broken by the weight that broke through. Inside the chaotic bowl, 3 small shapes struggled to move, slipping against the slick sides, claws scrabbling uselessly at frozen dirt and timbers. Big, larger than the others, was up, shoulders heavy, leaping in frantic short bursts toward the wall. Each jump ended in desperate claws that threw earth and ice onto himself and others. Rusty, the red-tinged pup, paced tightly, panic replacing his usual restlessness. His head lifted often as he whined, ears flattened, tail tucked so tightly it seemed gone. The smallest, Stephen's third, lay half on his side near broken timber, his chest rising and falling faintly, fur dusted with snow and powdery crystals beginning to freeze. At the pit's edge, very close to the drop, Gray moved in tight circles, her body tense, ears back. Every few seconds she leaned, front legs braced, muzzle extended, teeth bared silently, trying to intimidate the pit's sides to free her pups. She once attempted to jump, gathering her hindquarters and launching downward, but or weight only carried or 2/3 of the way before slipping back, claws scratching the icy dirt. She landed hard, staggered, shook off, and resumed circling, eyes flashing in the cold light. Stephen stopped at the tree line, sending snow over the pit's edge. Gray looked up, sniffed, then locked eyes with him with force. The short distance between them disappeared, only their bodies and the world's edge remained. The fear was immediate, hot, and intense, flushing his neck and tingling fingers. He saw her head, jaw, teeth, and the power in her shoulders as she faced him. Instinct urged him to retreat, to create distance from her raw desperation. But he heard the pup's faint whines from below, saw third, shallow, breathing and trembling paws on the timber. Fear of her teeth fought with the realization that he alone had the tools to decide what would happen. He slowly raised his empty hand, palm out, fingers spread, as a subconscious admission of lack. The rifle on his back felt weightless. Gray glanced at the movement, then back to his face. Her stance shifted slightly, tense but not yet charging, coiled and ready to strike instantly if needed. Easy, he whispered, knowing the word meant little to her the way he intended, yet he spoke as if sound could bridge a gap. His voice was hoarse, raw from cold in the climb, with most air stolen by the wind before reaching his ears. He rapidly scanned the scene for a way down and up, that didn't involve risking himself tumbling into the tangle of timber and ice. Near the edge, partially buried under snowdrifts, he spotted what he needed: the tops of old fence rails or remnants of the root cellar's beams, laid out long ago and now sunk into the hillside, their ends sticking out like bones of a long-dead animal. He shifted sideways slowly, each step causing snow to slide into the pit, while Gray watched, her breath forming white clouds. He brushed snow off the nearest rail with gloves, revealing old weathered wood that creaked but held his weight. About 8 or 9 feet long and thick enough for a man, he levered one end out, causing debris to fall. The scraping made Pups flinch. Rusty pressed against Big in fear, and Gray growled low, uncertain whom to watch first. He laid the rail at the pit's edge, lowering it until it formed a fragile bridge between two sides. As it settled, frost and snow fell on the Pups. Big yelped in shock, pupils narrowing as curiosity or recognition flickered across his face. For a moment, nothing moved. The rail lay slightly tilted, its old splintered surface catching faint light, as Steven sensed seconds stretching endlessly, making the skin on his neck itch, as if an invisible clock was counting down once he placed the wood. Big moved instinctively, drawn by something in his small, harsh world. He slunk forward, shoulders low, tail tucked, sniffing the damp base of the rail, his breath forming fleeting clouds. "Come on," Steven whispered without thinking, his knees bent and hands gripping the rail tightly, fingers aching. "Come on, you stubborn thing." Big shifted weight, placing a paw on the rail then another, his claws clicking on frozen grain, beginning to climb with awkward scrambles rather than a smooth ascent. He slid sideways as he lost grip, pushing his hind legs against the pit's floor. Twice he nearly fell, catching himself with frantic twists and claws, and each time Steven's stomach clenched, muscles tightening as if he could lend strength through the wood. Gray focused intently on the struggling body, her growls softened to a steady rumble, a sign of urgent helplessness rather than threat. When Big reached the last foot of the rail, his paws grasped the crumbling edge of the pit, nails digging into the packed snow below. Steven lunged forward, dropping to his knees, gloves scraping ice as he grabbed the pup by the scruff, the matted fur hot against his fingers, loose and stretchy like young animals. Big jerked once in alarm, twisting his head weakly towards Steven, but before fear turned into a bite, Steven pulled him over the lip, catching a rear leg and swinging the animal away from the drop. He set him down a few yards back on solid ground between two small firs, positioning himself between the pup and Gray, though unintentionally. Big staggered, shook off snow in a glittering cloud, then walked toward his mother, who met him halfway with a fierce mix of sniffs, licks, and chuffing sounds, reproachful yet relieved. She nipped his shoulder gently, not hurting but asserting herself, then snapped her gaze back to the pit, as if retrieving one prize sharpened her focus for the next. Rusty retreated behind the hole during Big's climb, pressed into the corner where wall and timber meet, trembling with white eyes. The rail was now closer, its base sunken into the mess, and when Steven adjusted it, it slipped, skidding sideways in the slush. It teetered, threatening to fall, forcing Steven to lean on top, boots in the snow to keep it steady. "Come on, kid," he muttered, teeth clenched, wrestling the wood into position, shoulders burning. "This is your shot." Rusty hesitated, first trying to rush to the rail, then slipping back, with his back legs sliding in the muck and his tail pressed down. The third attempt brought change, perhaps the tilt of Gray's head, the faint twitch from Third lying still in the corner, or fatigue from fear. Rusty took a few shaky low-nosed steps, ears pressed flat, paws on the wood. His climb was harder than Big's, his lighter frame working against him, each effort only inching him up before slipping back. Steven steadied the rail more securely this time, his weight better balanced, but his arms trembled, forearm muscles burning, breath quickening from effort. Rusty's claws traced thin streaks on the frost, his body flat, and against the rail as he clung, hanging for a tense second with limbs splayed as the rail shifted. He then managed to hook a paw over a knot and pull himself up a few inches. When his head reached Stephen's boots, he froze, eyes wide, nostrils flaring at the towering figure above. They stared briefly, and Stephen saw not wildness, but pure raw fear, an unworldly young creature, unsure of the hand reaching for it. Moving slowly, he slipped his fingers beneath Rusty's chest, feeling his rapid heartbeat through the ribs, then gently lifted, the pup light compared to his own burden. Rusty shivered once, then went limp in Stephen's hands, his body trembling as he was set down beside Big. The latter nosed and jostled him, checking if his littermate was real. Gray quickly approached as Rusty touched ground, her head passing Stephen's shoulder close enough for him to feel her breath's heat and dampness through his coat. She gently took her second pup into her mouth, gripping him by the shoulders, then lowered him as if inspecting each limb. Her flank brushed his sleeve, coarse fur grazing him, and his instinctive flinch to pull back clashed with the understanding that sudden movement might spook her into biting. He kept still, muscles tense, and after more frantic sniffs and licks, she stepped away a bit, Rusty leaning against her front leg, both panting into the cold. Only Third remained. Stephen looked into the pit, his vision briefly blurring from cold, fatigue, or something else he couldn't identify. The smallest pup lay where he'd fallen, slightly shifted by snow and debris from the rescues, curled up with his head resting awkwardly against a splintered beam. His sides still moved minimally, the rising and falling so slight that Stephen had to concentrate to confirm it wasn't a hallucination. Frost lined his whiskers and ears with tiny, shiny spikes, and a profound stillness in his limbs betrayed deeper cold. He knew practically that the rail wouldn't suffice this time. Even if Third woke enough to climb, his muscles wouldn't respond. His remaining heat was dedicated to vital functions, not paw and claw movements. To save the wolf, Stephen would have to descend himself. The idea made his body rebel. Winter time climbing into a whole 10 feet into unstable snow and rotten wood with a panicked wolf mother nearby was the kind of risk he normally dismissed as foolish. Such a fall often ended in reports of found deceased, probable cause, fall. The walls might collapse, beams shift, Gray could break the truce and attack. Then the pup made a faint breathy whine, a small cold body protesting. He instinctively unzipped his coat, preparing to descend carefully like a man minimizing injury risk. Gray moved closer, she angled, teeth flashed warning. He felt her breath and wolf's scent, nerves urging retreat. But he didn't. He muttered last one, unsure if to her himself, then lowered himself over the edge, feeling for the first timber, hands gripping the cold crumbling wall. The pit reeked of damp earth, old wood, animal musk from pups, with metallic fear, faint urine, and feces sensed body responses to terror. His boots slipped on ice, slamming his chest into the wall and knocking the breath out. His fingers scrabbled in frozen dirt, finding nothing. His boot caught a beam, its edge piercing the sole, halting his slide while his arms burned under strain. He dropped more than climbed, letting gravity take over as he judged he was close enough, landing awkwardly on one knee amidst snow and timber. Pain shot through his leg in a fiery streak, narrowing his vision, but he endured, inhaling a glass-like breath. Moving quickly, he knew time was scarce, the walls closed above, the sky a ragged circle, and at the edge he saw Gray's head the ears forward, tense body, claws gripping the snow as she shifted, torn between retreating from the trap and staying close to her pup. He covered the few steps to Third in 3 strides, boots slipping on ice, but moving him forward, and knelt, ignoring his injured leg's protest. Up close, the pup seemed even smaller, fur matted with damp patches from melting snow, eyes half closed, rimmed with frost. Stephen slit his hands under the limp body, feeling the icy ribs and a faint heartbeat against his palm, then lifted him and cradled him against his chest. The pup was nearly weightless, bones felt sharp beneath the skin, fragile and unprotected. Without overthinking, he tucked Third inside his coat, pressing the little body against his warm shirt, against his core heat. The cold fur against his bare chest made him hiss, but then he sensed a small tentative movement muscles trying to remember their function with the warmth. He zipped his coat as far as possible, trapping the tiny bundle against him, and turned to the wall. Climbing with both hands free was tough. Doing it with one arm glued to his side was even harder. He pushed off, found the same beam he used to descend, and started climbing, his fingers gripping frozen earth, splinters, and rough wood seams, his breath loud in the confined space. His foot slipped once, swinging his body into the wall, snow and dirt showering his face. Third muffled a sound in his coat, showing he felt the impact. At the top, his hand shot out, grabbing the rail's rough edge with pure, relentless grip. For an instant, his boot lost hold, leaving him hanging by his fingers and friction against the wall, his body weight and a flicker of warmth tugging at his shoulder. But some quiet, stubborn part of him, growing all winter, pushed him to pull, muscles screaming, teeth clenched in a silent snarl, matching any graze. Hands finally grabbed him. He thought his heartbeat was the wolf's, that those jaws had clamped his collar, but the grip was human rough, gloved fingers, pulling him up and over the edge with force and momentum. He tumbled onto the snow, rolling away from the pit in a clumsy, sprawling motion onto his back, gasping, snow in his hair and beard, his heart pounding so hard it shook his chest. He half expected teeth or claws, but Gray hadn't come for him. She stood a yard away, tense, nose working at his half-zipped coat's front, eyes wild and fixed. The brief shove on his arm was his own, a desperate jerk his shocky brain misinterpreted as aid. He fumbled with the zipper, fingers numb and clumsy, opening it enough for a small gray head to emerge, eyes blinking slowly in the cold. Third's nose twitched, his breath faint and shaky as he paused there, partly in Stephen's warmth, partly in the winter caught between two states. Then Gray moved swiftly over the icy snow, and her muzzle gently enclosed the pup, teeth softly gripping his shoulders as she lifted him from the human's chest and placed him in the hollow between her front legs. She began tending to him with a fierce tenderness, licking, nudging, pushing him with her nose, rolling him slightly, her tongue rasping through his fur with vigorous, long strokes that dried and stimulated. Under her care, he twitched, coughed once with a wet sound, then inhaled deeply, his body shuddering as some core engine ignited. Big in rusty pressed clothes, noses probing and sniffing, their tails wagging in short, controlled arcs that betrayed their confusion and relief. Stephen lay propped on one elbow, feeling the cold bite through his damp, thin wool shirt, as his coat gaped open, watching the gray cluster ahead. His hands trembled, not just from the cold, and every muscle in his arms and shoulders throbbed with a deep, gratifying ache from pushing himself to his limit. For once, his thoughts didn't race ahead or dwell on past failures. He simply observed the scene, hearing horse whines, smelling wolf, breath, and thawed fur in the crisp air. After what might have been seconds or minutes' time had become strange for him between the first howl and now Gray lifted her head from third and looked at him. Her eyes showed a strange, unreadable expression. It was neither gratitude nor forgiveness, nor any words people often use to describe animals' faces. Instead, she gave a long, steady look, heavy with recognition, as if she were updating an internal map that had only seen him as a threat before. They held that gaze for a few heartbeats, feeling timeless outside his world, the valley silent except for their breaths and distant faint creak of trees in the cold. Then, without fanfare, she turned, nudged her pups into motion, and moved into the trees, her gait unhurried but purposeful, the tiny bodies stumbling after her. Snow drifted from branches and patches that briefly obscured them before they vanished into the shadows and pale light between trunks. Stephen stayed on his knees beside the jagged mouth of the pit, hands on his thighs, coat open, the cold finally biting through the warmth he'd kept while third pressed against him. His breath formed visible puffs, each a quiet sign of the cold morning. He gazed into the hole once more at the broken snow and exposed beams space that, until recently, held 3 small lives on the verge of being lost, and somehow, through unplanned choices he had nevertheless made, failed to claim. His trembling fingers, red and stiff, raised doubts whether it was from the cold or something deeper. The days between the pit and Earl's next visit drifted by slowly yet weightlessly, as if time had shifted onto a different track. On the surface, Stephen's routine remained unchanged, chopping and transporting wood, checking traps, clearing creosote from the stovepipe, patching the water bucket's crack with pine and pitch. Yet each action carried within it the memory of that distant horse howl at dawn and the cold weight of Third's small body pressed against him. The valley itself seemed to resonate with a different tone, as if some subtle chord had been added beneath its usual winter silence. After that morning, he saw less of the pack, at least directly. Their howls still echoed at night, but their pattern changed. The long choruses, once coming from the first den, now sounded farther up the ridge with different angles and echoes, bouncing off new rocks and trees. When he crossed the basin again days later, more to satisfy curiosity than to see them, he found the root cellar's hollow empty, the wolf scent faded, and fresh tracks circled the pit at a distance, as if the land now deemed it dangerous. Kneeling at the hole's edge, he looked down at broken beams and churned earth, his footprints already blurred by dust, trying to imagine moving 3 pups, one still unsteady through winter's terrain. He pictured Gray lifting them one by one, their bodies dangling, paws drawn tight, as she carried them across crusted snow, possibly with another wolf nearby or alone. The thought briefly made him hopeful. Despite the valley's hardships, they had the instinct and strength to begin anew on safer ground. Back at the cabin, life shrank as year's end neared. Days shortened, their thin bluish light on the snow at noon, and he spent more time indoors, the walls closing in, but less oppressive than earlier in the season. A new calm filled that small room, neither ghostly nor intrusive, but a quietness he hadn't felt in a long time. It was not the dull numbness of depression, but a sharp stillness, like a pond after the wind dies down, its surface reflective rather than churning. He caught himself multiple times, sitting at the table with a mug, staring blankly while recent memories played in no particular order, Anne's face in dim hospital light, Gray's eyes over the pit, Earl's worn hands around his mug, Lily laughing on the distant porch. These images no longer carried the same harsh sting. Anne's warning about trusting his judgment now felt more practical than reproach. On the 5th day after the rescue, as the year neared its end and snow outside had settled into deceptive softness hiding a treacherous crust, he heard boots on the porch again. No storm roared around the cabin this time, no blizzard muffling sounds. The approach was clear snow crunching, muted steps on the porch, a brief pause before a knock. He had been by the stove, trying to ignite a reluctant piece of birch, and froze when he heard the first step, every muscle tightening as if braced for impact. He remembered the flattened patch outside from earlier, overlaying the new sound, and by the time the 3 measured knocks echoed, his jaw had set into a familiar line. He didn't rush to answer. He gently set the poker down, wiped his hands on his pants, and paused, gaining a moment to speak confidently rather than react. Then he approached and opened the door. Earl stood there, lit by cold, pale light, zipped-up parka, frost on his beard, steady breath, looking much the same as before, with boots, a worn cap, and rifle in hand, but with a subtle shift in focused, rehearsed intensity. "Morning," he said, his tone relaxed, but not quite casual. "I wondered if you were still breathing after that hit. You weren't there yesterday when we passed." Stephen felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing his guess about the flattened snow was right, but he kept it to himself. "Still breathing," he said. "Come in. It's colder than it looks outside." Earl stepped inside, lightly stomping snow off his boots, and quickly surveyed the cabin. His eyes noted small changes, more wood near the stove, the trap in the corner, cleaned and coiled, different from Stephen's usual equipment. If he recognized his own steel in that form, he chose not to comment immediately. Removing his gloves, he flexed his fingers and accepted the coffee Stephen poured, wrapping his hands around it with clear appreciation. The cabin's air felt thicker with another presence, the mix of their breaths and the stove's heat filling the small space. Stephen became acutely aware of every small sound the metals tick as the stove expanded, the faint drip of melting snow from Earl's coat hitting the floor, and the barely audible clink of Earl's mug on the table. They initially talked about typical subjects for men in their position: the storm's track, wind-blown trees along the ridge, a minor slight Earl saw on the far slope, and a small compliment on how Stephen's cabin endured the load. It was a familiar, courteous dance, each allowing the other to show fatigue, annoyance, or humor, but beneath their words, something strained grew tighter. After a while, Earl set his mug down deliberately and leaned back slightly, his hands loosely in his lap. His pale, steady eyes fixed on Stephen's face, removing all minor distractions. "I didn't come for weather talk," he said plainly, with no pretense. "It's time to be direct and know where we stand this winter." Stephen nodded slightly and remained silent, letting Earl start. "You've seen the sign, like I have," Earl added, "a large pack working this drainage with substantial animals. You don't need me to explain what that means, what the state's paying, and what the Valley folks want gone. You can see we've already started thinning them." He said we without apology or embellishment, and the image of the young wolf in the snow, leg caught in his steel trap, flickered in Stephen's mind with such clarity that he could smell the frozen blood again. "What I'm thinking," Earl continued, "is that this doesn't have to be a pissing contest. You've got eyes on this place, lines already drawn, and I lack details on their exact movements. I have tags, crews, buyers ready. If we coordinate, both walk away richer and the ridge quieter at season's end. You may not agree with our plans, but it's wise to join in." That was the offer, straightforward and practical, not threatening but inviting, urging reason and shared effort. Earl's face remained unchanged as he spoke. His tone was steady, almost conversational, and that calmness, more than any bravado, made the room feel tighter. Stephen sensed the familiar instinct rising, the one honed by years in fire crews and bureaucracy, to shrink at the table, nodding outwardly while his true thoughts retreated, feeling that refusing could mark him as difficult. That reflex had helped in crowded offices and briefings, but here, in the thin-walled cabin with snow pressing in and a pup's fading whine echoing near his sternum, it felt like a betrayal. He inhaled, tasting coffee, smoke, and Earl's cold scent, then fixed his gaze on the small scarred tabletop, worn smooth from years of use. When he lifted his head, some old fear disappeared. "I'm not cutting in," he said clearly, not rushed or hesitant, and he was surprised how natural it sounded. "I'm not leading you to them or helping you run them out." Earl's eyes flickered briefly, not shock, but a change, like a card he expected to play smoothly caught on the table's edge. He didn't scowl or raise his voice. Instead, he grew even more silent. "Do you have a special fondness for wolves?" he asked, with a light tone but a firm underlying edge. "Last I checked, they aren't much for companionship. They won't thank you. They'd take your dog or deer like anyone's." Stephen briefly remembered Gray's unreadable stare after the pit, and the modest cooperation he imagined the pack removing sick elk to strengthen the herd or cleaning the system as predators do, but he didn't address it. It would seem like an argument or an attempt to convert Earl, which wasn't the point here. "It's not about thanks," he said. "It's what I can live with when I sleep here." He nodded slightly toward the bunk. "I removed a trap on your trail and pulled 3 pups from a hole they couldn't escape. That's my focus. Do what you'll do, but I won't lead you to their den." He knew Earl's trap removal was a confrontation. Earl's jaw subtly clenched, signaling a shift from neighborly quirks to hostility. "You understand what this means," Earl said calmly, voice flatter, losing its earlier ease, crossing into a man's space, taking what's his. "It's like tearing down his walls. People don't do that unless they're prepared for the consequences." "I understand," Stephen said. "I also see what letting it stay there would have caused. We're both risking trouble." A pause followed, long enough for the stove's expansion and a draft's faint hiss to fill the silence. Earl's steady gaze turned inward, as if calculating whether to act now or wait for winter or luck to change things. Finally, he pushed back his chair, the legs scraping softly, and rose, carefully placing the mug on the table without a sound. "If that's how you choose to handle it," he said. The words weren't a question. "You make your choices. Just know I'll be making mine. Wolves don't live forever, nor do men. The only difference is men choose what to stand on before they die." He grabbed his gloves, slipped them on swiftly, each finger fitting snugly, then pulled his cap lower over his forehead. He paused at the door, hand on the latch, then glanced back. Shame, though he said, his tone returning briefly to the friendly manner from their coffee. A winter's long with only ghosts and conscience. Having flesh and blood company, even arguing, isn't the worst. Stephen stayed silent, with many retorts on his tongue about the quality of company or quiet, but they felt petty or too grand for this small room. Instead, he simply met Earl's gaze, letting his eyes speak. Earl opened the door, cold air rushed in, flickering the stove's flame. Snow briefly illuminated the narrow space, casting stark faces, then he stepped out, closing it softly. The cabin returned to silence as he disappeared into the snow-covered forest. Stephen paused, hand on Earl's chair, feeling the warmth fade. Part of him, afraid of conflict, regretted turning an ally into an enemy. The next encounter might not be courteous. Another, calmer part exhaled. Later, with daylight strengthening and his mind clear, he climbed toward the old den, not expecting wolves, but needing to see its emptiness firsthand. The basin now had a fresh snow cover, softening the pit's edges and blurring the dogs and his footprints, the marks of his frantic climb, into subtle irregularities in the whiteness. He paused at the edge, listening to the cold's faint groan of trees and a distant woodpecker's tapping down slope. The air no longer carried the sharp musk of a wolf, only the crisp scent of winter. Closing his eyes, he almost convinced himself the den, pups, and Gray's stare had been merely a dream born of hunger and solitude. As he turned to go, a small, unlikely shape on the narrow trail back to the cabin caught his eye. Lying in the snow at the center of the path, unmistakably placed, was half a jackrabbit carcass cleanly severed at the hindquarters, with legs still attached, fur frosted white. It was undamaged and intact, with no torn flesh or scattered remains. The break was precise, almost purposeful, as if the jaws had carefully measured the division. Surrounding it were tracks, wolf prints of various sizes, but no signs of scavengers had tampered with the offering. It had been placed here deliberately, not dropped or forgotten, aligned with the trail and facing his cabin. He stood over it, the cold air burning his lungs, and unexpectedly laughed a short, breathy sound that steamed in the freezing air, more surprised than amused. He couldn't say, and never would, what message lay behind this strange grisly gift, whether it was just leftovers, the pack leaving part of their kill, or a primitive form of reciprocity, rooted in instinct rather than gratitude. It didn't matter. What mattered was how his mouth shifted at the corners as he looked, the strange, nearly rusty sensation of his face forming a painless smile. By March, winter's sharpness softened into a heavier, wetter chill that seeped into clothes, wood, and bones. The snow around the cabin no longer maintained its crisp crust. By late morning, a thin, damp sheen appeared, and boots sinking deeper into slush with each step. Though temperatures still dipped low, the daylight lengthened and sharpened, making the valley seem less like an icy edge, less whirled. The sounds shifted too, from the dry hiss of wind and cracking trees to the irregular drip of meltwater from eaves, spruce boughs, and thinning icicles on the shaded side. On sunny days, a faint medicated aroma rose from the snow as crystals softened and released trapped scents, while subtly a hint of earth, weak, damp, and dull, began to stir beneath the white, signaling the start of awakening. Inside, the cabin felt smaller as departure approached. Stephen's gear, which had filled every corner during winter reorganization, now clustered neatly into piles only he understood, traps cleaned and stored in one bag, tools in another, clothing tightly rolled and secured with cords he trusted. He moved through this quiet disassembly of winter life with relief and a strange reluctance, carefully handling items he had cursed in November when they took up space, now touching them gently. Having done this 8 times before, each winter's end, this year felt different. Each object seemed linked to the months behind him. The wool shirt wrapping the photograph of Anne and Lily emerged with its usual weight, but when unfolded, the picture no longer hit him as sharply as before. The faces remained the same: Anne's half-squinting smile, Lily's sticky hand with a melting popsicle, yet something had shifted in him. The pain wasn't gone, it never would be. Other, newer images now sat alongside it instead of beneath, Gray's eyes over the pit's edge, Third's cold breath against his chest, wolf prints leading away toward a hidden home. He studied the photo at the small table, noon light illuminating its edges. Memories surfaced: Anne's laughter, Lily's feet against his seat, his wife's hand in his as a doctor, spoke carefully, and he did not avoid them. The pain had changed, now more like a scar that pulled with weather. After a while, he put the photo back in its flannel wrap, this time in his coat's inner pocket to carry down from the hills. Leaving day arrived silently. He woke before dawn, as usual, in a cabin that felt emptier, not from lack of supplies, but because familiar details had vanished: the extra boots on his pack, the wire roll taken down, the last half-empty coffee tin. He lit the lantern once more, out of habit rather than need, brewed coffee, and sipped slowly, savoring each drink more than usual. He checked the cabin one last time, running his hand along the bunk frame, peering into corners cleared of mice, lifting the stove lid to ensure no embers remained. Satisfied, he banked a small ash pile in the stove and closed the iron door, the latch clicking shut with a weightier finality than words. Outside, the sky had turned a bright, painfully clear blue that March sometimes painted mountains with, a color that seemed warm but was not. The snow in the clearing sagged at the edges, melting away from rocks and logs where the sun had touched, with dark tongue-like patches of earth emerging near tree bases, like punctuation on a blank page. He hoisted his pack with a practiced shift, feeling the straps bite into his coat and settle as he adjusted until the weight sat properly. Though heavy, it was honest. His legs acknowledged each step without feeling overwhelmed. He took one last look at the cabin, its logs dark against the snow, the stovepipe a crooked line against the sky, and felt that familiar small pang, the one that came each year as he turned away from this rough, inconvenient structure that had become, in its way, more home than the Whitefish house. Then he began down the trail. The initial steps required careful attention. The snow was unpredictable. Some crusts supported him, while others punched through up to his knee into cold, grainy mush that clung to his boots and made his thigh muscles work hard to escape. Meltwater had created thin rivulets that froze overnight into slick patches, demanding caution. Clearwater Creek, once a silent, solid ribbon beneath snow, now whispered differently as he approached, a faint tinkling of water flowing over and under ice, with dark pools visible in spots. He crossed at his usual place. The log bridge still held, though its damp, slick surface darkened by thaw. On the far bank, trees gradually thinned, revealing more sky, and he felt, with each step, the shift from his secluded winter drainage into the broader landscape leading to the gravel road in town. The air here smelled less of resin and ice, more of distant wood smoke and faint human presence. He walked for hours, his body settling into a steady rhythm that allowed contemplation without worry. His mind drifted back over winter blizzard, Den, Earl's threats, Jackrabbit and Forward, cautiously considering the town, the grocery with bright lights, newspaper rack, clerk who knew him only as the quiet man, his brother's rental house, the shared couch with an overgrown plant. He pictured himself there, not as a ghost, but as a man sitting at a table, answering questions without cost. The weight on his back shifted with each step, echoing his movement. The photo in his coat pocket, pressed against his chest, warmed with his body heat. Its presence was steady, but neither oppressive nor comforting, just there, like a small hand on his sternum. Less than a mile from the tree line and the last open stretch before the road, he sensed it a prickling at the back of his neck, unrelated to wind or cold, that indicated someone was watching from just beyond his peripheral vision. Over years in similar places, he had learned to trust this feeling more than most thoughts. His skin often sensed company before his mind. He slowed slightly, enough to breathe easier, and let his gaze wander without snapping his head, knowing sudden movement might reveal something. At first, he saw only what he expected, the uneven mottled edge of the forest ahead, where spruce and fir transitioned to a narrow band of cottonwoods by a small creek with a snow-covered meadow in between. The snow bore faint deer tracks and recent marks from a single man traveling maybe a week earlier. The sky above was a washed-out blue, the low sun casting long thin beams across the field, creating deep blue shadows of the trees on the snow. Then he noticed a shape that didn't belong to any trunk, branch, or rock. She stood at the forest edge, just inside the shade, where trees meet sunlight, half in, half out, as if retreating. Gray, her thick coat full, maintained his steady familiar stance, legs straight, head level, ears alert, tail relaxed behind her. They were no more than 30 yards apart, a small field's length, easily reachable. In another life, with a different rifle, it would have been an easy shot. He paused. Her pack was missing. He saw no other movement or eyes in the shadows, though they could still be there. Wolves could easily vanish into trees and terrain unseen, but in that moment, it seemed just the two of them in a narrow snow strip. The meadow's snow lay smooth and unbroken, the soft top reflecting the sky almost blue, crisscrossed by tree shadows behind Gray, forming cool striped lines. His tracks, the paired impressions he made all day, ended a few steps back, indicating his hesitation, and he was oddly aware how obvious it would be to anyone finding them. A man leaving the hills, stopping uncertainty. He did not reach for his rifle. The idea didn't even trigger muscles. The gun was heavy and irrelevant on his back, a tool for another time and task. His hands hung loosely at his sides, the dark gloves contrasting with the snow as he remained still, letting his breath slow and the steam thin out. From this distance, Gray's eyes were more than neutral. He could see their shape in the fur patterns around them, giving her expression an ambiguous look, something between curiosity and assessment. He knew better than to interpret that gaze through human motives, but also understood that our focus was entirely on him now. They stayed that way for what felt like a brief moment, a few seconds, perhaps longer, without movement, the space filled only with light, cold, and distant meltwater drips from the trees. An absurd urge arose in him to speak aloud, to acknowledge the strange shared pause that had led to this, the howls outside his cabin, the den, the trap he'd removed, the pit, the rabbit on his trail. Yet he held back, knowing nothing would be gained by filling this delicate silence with words. She subtly shifted her weight, a small deliberate move signaling a decision. Instead of startling, she turned smoothly, with a calm unhurried twist, her paws moving carefully as usual, then strode into the trees. Her tail remained level, head low but relaxed, and within a few steps, trunks and shadows obscured her, blending her gray and white coat with the forest patchwork, so he could no longer see her. Stephen lingered, observing where she had been, feeling her presence in the air's shift and his skin's memory of her gaze. He wondered if she recognized him from the basin and pit, whether wolves retain such memories, or if he was just another human figure in a landscape filled with many. He couldn't tell if her look carried meaning, or if that weight was solely his own. He knew that, with his pack on his shoulders and the road ahead, any meaning he found was his alone. There would be no confirmation or clear sign that everything added up. Nature offered no moral certificates. The wolves would continue or not based on forces beyond him. Earl's choices and the weather's randomness would shape events, with spring arriving on its own schedule. He took a deep, slow breath, filling his lungs with cold that no longer felt threatening. Adjusting his pack straps, he felt their rough fabric press into his coat padding, then stepped forward. His boots broke the snow surface, carving temporary wounds that would fill as the day warmed. As he moved, the cabin, the den, the pit, and gray at the tree line blurred into a single memory that would accompany him whether he wished it or not. The trees thinned, shadows receded, and the valley revealed itself, spilling cold and silence toward the narrow road and human world beyond. He did not speed up, there was no need. For the first time in a long while, he felt no urge to escape or outrun his burden. The weight, grief, choices, ghosts, fur, iron remained, but now it sat more evenly, as if his spine had learned to bear it. He kept walking.